Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the worn leather boots of a medieval peasant facing every family's worst nightmare. A year when the crops fail, the stores run empty, and survival becomes a daily battle against starvation. You can almost feel the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, the weight of responsibility pressing down on your shoulders as you stare at grain sacks that should be full but contain only a few handfuls of precious wheat. The wooden walls of your humble cottage seem to close in around you as winter's icy breath seeps through every crack, and you realize with crystal clarity that this year will test every survival skill your family has ever learned, every piece of wisdom passed down through generations of hardship. This isn't just another difficult winter. This is the kind of year that reshapes entire communities, that turns neighbours into strangers and forces ordinary people to make extraordinary choices. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why certain medieval practices seem so strange, why communities were so tightly knit, and why our ancestors developed such intricate knowledge about plants, weather, and preservation techniques that we've largely forgotten today. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. I'd love to hear where and when you started watching this video. Or perhaps you could share a compliment about what draws you to these historical journeys we take together each night. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn on a morning that feels different from all the others. The silence outside your cottage carries an ominous weight, no birdsong, no rustling of small creatures foraging in the underbrush, just the hollow whisper of wind through bare branches. Your breath forms small clouds in the frigid air as you slip from beneath the rough wool blankets you share with your spouse and children. The embers in your hearth have died to cold ash, and you know that every stick of firewood must now be carefully rationed. Moving quietly across the packed earth floor, you make your way to the corner where your family's winter stores should provide comfort and security. Instead, your heart sinks as you lift the wooden lid of the grain chest. What should contain enough wheat, barley, and oats to last until spring now holds perhaps 3 weeks' worth of food. If you're extremely careful, the mice have been at it too, their tiny teeth marks scoring the few remaining kernels, their droppings scattered throughout what should be your family's lifeline. Your hands shake slightly as you scoop up a handful of grain, feeling its weight, counting each precious kernel. This is the moment when abstract worry transforms into cold, hard reality. The harvest failed spectacularly this year, victim to a spring that arrived too late, a summer that brought too much rain followed by devastating drought, and an autumn that ended with early frost destroying what little had managed to grow. You're not alone in this crisis. Every cottage in your village faces the same terrifying mathematics of survival. The medieval world operates on razor-thin margins that modern people can barely comprehend. There are no grocery stores to visit when supplies run low, no government assistance programs to provide emergency food, no complex supply chains bringing sustenance from distant lands. You and your family exist within a closed system where the success or failure of local crops determines whether you live or die. The feudal manor that surrounds your village produces almost everything its inhabitants consume, and when that production fails, alternatives are scarce and often impossible to obtain. Outside your cottage, the landscape tells the same grim story. Fields that should be covered with stubble from a successful harvest instead show bare earth, scattered with the withered remains of crops that never had a chance to mature, your neighbour's vegetable garden, usually a riot of preserved cabbages and root vegetables carefully stored in underground cellars, now contains only empty holes where families have already consumed their winter reserves. The communal bread oven at the village centre sits cold and unused. There simply isn't enough grain to justify the precious fuel required to heat its stone chambers. You think about the choices ahead, each one fraught with life or death consequences. Do you slaughter your family's pig now, ensuring meat for the immediate future but eliminating a source of spring piglets that could sustain you through the next year? Should you consume the seed grain that represents hope for next year's planting, trading future survival for present sustenance? These decisions would have seemed impossible just months ago, but now they press against your consciousness with urgent intensity. The medieval peasant's relationship with hunger differs fundamentally from modern experiences of food insecurity. You've known lean times before, periods when meals became smaller, when meat disappeared from your family's diet, when creativity in the kitchen stretched limited ingredients into something resembling sustenance. But famine represents something qualitatively different, a systematic breakdown of the agricultural calendar that governs medieval life. It's not just about being hungry, it's about watching the entire framework of survival collapse around you. Historians still argue whether medieval famines were primarily caused by climate fluctuations, overpopulation, or inadequate agricultural techniques. But from your perspective as someone living through the crisis, the cause matters less than the immediate challenge of keeping your family alive. You know that families in the next village over are already abandoning their homes, loading whatever possessions they can carry onto crude carts and setting out on the dangerous roads between settlements, hoping to find better conditions elsewhere. The social order that normally governs medieval life begins to strain under the pressure of genuine scarcity. Your lord, who typically commands absolute obedience and regular tribute, now faces the same fundamental challenge you do: how to distribute resources that simply don't exist in sufficient quantities. The church, usually a source of comfort and spiritual guidance, becomes a focal point for desperate prayers and increasingly frequent funeral services as the weakest members of your community succumb to hunger and the diseases that follow in its wake. You realize that surviving this crisis will require every skill your ancestors developed, every bit of knowledge about edible plants, food preservation, and resource management that previous generations accumulated through similar trials. The old woman who lives at the edge of your village, often dismissed as eccentric for detailed knowledge of forest plants and traditional remedies, suddenly becomes one of the most valuable people in your community. Her seemingly odd habits of collecting unusual roots and drying strange leaves now reveal themselves as survival wisdom accumulated over decades of experience. As you close the grain chest and return to your family's sleeping area, you understand that this year will strip away many of the comfortable assumptions that usually govern daily life. You'll need to become someone you've never been before, more resourceful, more decisive, more willing to take risks that would have seemed unthinkable during prosperous times. The gentle person who shared surplus vegetables with neighbours during good harvests must now calculate every morsel with mathematical precision, weighing compassion against survival with a clarity that cuts through sentiment like winter wind through wool cloth. The famine year begins not with dramatic catastrophe, but with this quiet morning recognition that everything has changed, that the familiar rhythms of medieval life have been replaced by something far more demanding and dangerous, something that will test every assumption about community, family, morality, and the very meaning of survival itself. You step outside into the grey morning light, your breath forming small clouds as you begin the careful observation that has become second nature to every peasant family. Reading nature's warning signs isn't just folklore or superstition, it's a sophisticated system of environmental monitoring that your ancestors developed over centuries of agricultural survival. The ability to interpret subtle changes in weather patterns, animal behaviour, and plant responses often means the difference between preparing adequately for lean times and being caught completely unprepared when disaster strikes. The sky tells stories that modern meteorologists would recognise, though you lack their technical vocabulary to describe what you're seeing. Those high, wispy clouds stretching across the horizon like pulled wool indicate atmospheric pressure changes that typically precede major weather shifts. When the cirrus persist for days without the usual afternoon build-up of cumulus clouds, experienced farmers know that the normal seasonal patterns are disrupting. You've learned to watch for the peculiar stillness that settles over the landscape when air masses stall, creating the kind of persistent weather conditions that can destroy entire growing seasons. Your grandfather taught you to observe the oak trees with the particular attention during spring and early summer. Oak leaves that emerge unusually early often indicate a false spring that will be followed by devastating late frosts. Conversely, when oak leaves delay their appearance well past the normal timing, it usually signals an extended period of cold, wet conditions that will challenge crop germination and early growth. Yes. This year, you noticed both patterns, an early leaf emergence followed by an unusual second dormancy period, a confusion in the tree's natural timing that reflected the chaotic weather patterns affecting your entire region. The behaviour of wild animals provides another crucial layer of information for predicting agricultural challenges. Squirrels that begin hoarding usually early, gathering and burying nuts with frantic intensity months ahead of their normal schedule, often sense atmospheric pressure changes and temperature fluctuations that human senses cannot detect. You watched them this past summer, working with desperate urgency, their small bodies moving constantly between oak trees and their hidden storage sites, as if they understood something about the coming winter that hadn't yet become obvious to human observers. Birds offer particularly reliable indicators of changing environmental conditions. When swallows and martins, those aerial insectivores that normally arrive with mathematical precision each spring, appear weeks behind their usual schedule or fail to establish their customary nesting sites, it signals disruptions in the insect populations they depend upon. Insects, in turn, respond to soil moisture, temperature variations, and plant health in ways that create cascading effects throughout the entire agricultural ecosystem. This year, you noticed not just delayed bird arrivals but also unusual migration patterns, with some species that typically pass through your region instead lingering for extended periods, as if uncertain about conditions in their traditional destinations. Domestic animals provide the most immediate and reliable warning system for detecting environmental stress. Your chickens, normally reliable layers throughout most of the year, began reducing their egg production months before the harvest failure became obvious. Historians still argue whether this represents a direct physiological response to subtle environmental changes, or whether chickens somehow sense the stress levels of their human caretakers. But experienced peasant families learn to treat declining egg production as an early warning signal worthy of serious attention. The family cow, usually a steady producer of milk that supplements your household's nutrition and provides surplus for occasional trade, began showing signs of distress well before the pasture conditions became visibly problematic. Her milk production dropped noticeably, and she demonstrated unusual restlessness, spending more time than normal looking toward the forest edges rather than contentedly grazing in familiar pasture areas. Cattle possess sensory capabilities that detect changes in atmospheric pressure, ground vibration, and electromagnetic fields that accompany major weather pattern shifts, making them remarkably accurate predictors of environmental upheaval. Even the household cat, typically focused on hunting mice and rats around the grain storage areas, began exhibiting behavioral changes that suggested approaching difficulties. Cats that become unusually vocal, particularly with the kind of persistent calling that differs from their normal communication patterns, often signal their detection of increased rodent activity or changes in rodent behavior that indicate environmental stress. When your cat started spending more time outdoors and less time in the warm corners where she usually rested, you should have recognized it as confirmation of the warning signs accumulating from other sources. Plant behavior provides perhaps the most detailed information about developing environmental problems, though interpreting these signals requires the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from years of careful observation. Wild plants that typically flourish in marginal conditions, those hardy species that colonize disturbed soil and thrive in areas where cultivated crops struggle, began showing signs of stress months before your grain crops failed completely. When even the most resilient weeds struggle to establish themselves in areas where they normally grow abundantly, it indicates soil chemistry problems, moisture imbalances, or other fundamental environmental issues that will inevitably affect agricultural production. The timing of tree leafing, flowering, and fruit production creates a complex calendar that experienced observers use to predict growing season conditions. Fruit trees that bloom unusually early then experience frost damage, followed by secondary blooming attempts, exhaust their energy reserves and produce poor harvests even if later weather conditions improve. Apple and pear trees in your area exhibited exactly this pattern, creating a cascade of stress responses that affected not just the current year's fruit production, but also the tree's ability to survive winter and produce normally the following year. Wild berry production offers another reliable indicator of overall ecosystem health. Blackberries, elderberries, and other forest fruits that normally provide important dietary supplements during late summer and early autumn produce sparse, poorly developed fruits this year. The berry plants themselves appeared healthy, but their reproductive capacity seemed diminished, suggesting environmental stresses that weren't immediately visible but affected the entire regional ecosystem. Root vegetables growing in your family's garden displayed subtle signs of stress that became clear only in retrospect. Turnips and carrots that developed normally above ground revealed stunted, poorly formed root systems when finally harvested. Onions that appeared healthy while growing in the field produced bulbs that began rotting unusually quickly after harvest, indicating that environmental stress had compromised their storage capacity, even though they look normal when pulled from the soil. The forest itself provides a comprehensive barometer of environmental health for those who know how to read its signals. Trees that shed leaves earlier than normal, particularly when the early leaf drop affects multiple species simultaneously, indicate root system stress caused by soil moisture problems or underground environmental changes. Mushroom and fungi populations that fail to appear during their normal seasons, or that produce unusual varieties in unexpected locations, reflect changes in soil chemistry and moisture levels that affect the entire forest ecosystem. Traditional weather prediction methods, passed down through generations of agricultural families, combine observation of natural phenomena with recognition of larger seasonal patterns. The appearance of the unusual cloud formations, particularly those that persist for days without producing the expected precipitation, often precede extended periods of agricultural stress. When traditional weather signs stop correlating with expected outcomes, when red skies no longer reliably predict fair weather, when wind patterns fail to follow their normal seasonal shifts, experienced farmers recognize these disruptions as warnings of more significant environmental instability. The autumn air carries a desperate edge as you stand in what remains of your fields, making the most agonizing decision any peasant family faces during a famine year. The last harvest strategy isn't really about harvesting at all, it's about choosing between eating today and having hope for tomorrow. Your hands tremble slightly as you hold ears of corn that should be plump and golden, but instead show the withered, partially filled kernels that mark this season's failure. Every grain you save for next year's planting is a meal taken from your family's mouth during the hungry months ahead. Traditional agricultural wisdom teaches that successful farmers always reserve the best portion of their harvest for seed, ensuring future crops even during difficult years. But that wisdom assumes there's enough left over after seed selection to sustain humans' life through winter and spring. This year presents you with mathematics that don't balance. There simply isn't enough grain to do both adequately. You must choose which risk to take, starving this winter with plenty of seed for spring planting, or eating enough to survive but having little hope of a meaningful crop next year. You walk through the stunted rows of barley, each plant telling the story of this year's agricultural disaster. Early spring brought promising germination, with tiny green shoots emerging from the soil with encouraging regularity. Then came the late frost that killed perhaps a third of the seedlings, followed by weeks of cold rain that rotted many of the survivors. The summer drought stressed the remaining plants so severely that even when autumn rains finally arrived, the barley couldn't recover sufficiently to produce full heads of grain. The wheat presents an even more heartbreaking choice. Wheat serves as your family's primary bread grain, the foundation of every meal during normal years. The few wheat plants that managed to survive this year's challenges produced heads that contained perhaps a dozen kernels each, compared to the 40 or 50 kernels typical of healthy wheat in good growing conditions. Each head represents hours of careful cultivation, watering during dry spells, and protection from birds and rodents. Now you must decide how many of these precious heads to consume immediately and how many to save for seed. Your neighbour approaches across the field boundary, his face showing the same expression of grim calculation that you feel weighing on your own features. Medieval agricultural communities typically coordinate their planting and harvesting activities, sharing knowledge, labour, and sometimes resources during challenging periods. But famine years strain these cooperative relationships as each family focuses on its own survival. The conversation that follows involves careful diplomatic language as you both try to determine whether cooperation or competition will better serve your respective families' interests. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants made these crucial decisions based on accumulated traditional knowledge, or whether they simply responded to immediate pressures without long-term planning. But your experience suggests a more complex reality. Every peasant family carries stories passed down from previous famine years, accounts of strategies that succeeded or failed during earlier crises. Your grandmother often told stories about the Great Hunger that occurred 30 years before your birth, describing in vivid detail how families survived by making exactly these kinds of impossible choices between present survival and future hope. The decision-making process involves factors that extend far beyond simple mathematics. Different grains stored differently over winter, with some varieties maintaining their viability for spring planting better than others. Barley seed remains viable longer than wheat seed when stored in less than ideal conditions. But barley also provides less nutrition per grain when consumed as food. Oats store well and provide good nutrition for both humans and livestock, but oat crops typically produce lower yields than wheat or barley, making them a riskier choice for next year's primary grain crop. You examine each type of grain with the intensity of someone whose life depends on making the correct assessment. The wheat kernels should be plump and golden, with a hard exterior that indicates proper ripening and good storage potential. Instead, many kernels show the shriveled appearance that results from inadequate moisture during the crucial grain filling period. Some kernels appear darker than normal, suggesting fungal infections that could affect both their nutritional value and their ability to germinate successfully next spring. The timing of this decision adds another layer of complexity to an already difficult choice. Ideally, seed selection should occur immediately after harvest, when grain quality is most apparent and before storage conditions begin affecting viability. But during famine years, families often delay seed selection as long as possible, hoping that somehow additional food sources will become available that might change the calculation. Every week of delay increases the risk that moisture, insects, or rodents will damage the grain, but every week also represents another period when you might discover alternatives that could influence your decision. Storage considerations play a crucial role in seed selection strategy. The grain you save for planting must survive winter storage in much better condition than grain intended for immediate consumption. Seed grain requires the driest storage conditions, the most protection from rodents, and the most careful monitoring throughout the winter months. During abundant years, these requirements present manageable challenges. During famine years, when every storage container and every protective measure might be needed for food preservation, dedicating the best storage conditions to seed grain represents another significant sacrifice. Your children watch from the cottage doorway as you work through this process, their presence adding emotional weight to every decision. They understand enough about farming to recognize the seriousness of seed selection, but they lack the experience to fully comprehend the trade-offs involved. Their visible hunger makes the choice between saving grain for planting and providing immediate nourishment almost unbearably difficult. Medieval childhood often ended early when agricultural crises forced children to participate in adult decision-making, and you realize that this crisis will mature your own children in ways you would have preferred to prevent. The livestock complicates seed selection decisions in ways that urban people rarely consider. Your family's animals, chickens, pigs, perhaps a cow if you're fortunate, also need grain to survive winter. Livestock that die during winter eliminate sources of eggs, milk, meat, and labour that could be crucial for surviving the famine and recovering afterward. But feeding grain to animals while your family faces starvation presents ethical and practical dilemmas that have no clear resolution. Some grain varieties work better for animal feed than others, creating additional layers of complexity in allocation decisions. Weather patterns expected for the coming winter influence seed selection strategies in subtle but important ways. If winter promises to be particularly cold or wet, certain storage methods will work better than others, and some grain varieties will maintain their viability more successfully. Your grandfather's knowledge of seasonal weather patterns becomes invaluable as you try to predict storage conditions and plan accordingly. Traditional weather prediction methods, based on animal behavior, plant responses, and atmospheric observations, help guide decisions about which grains to save and how to store them most effectively. Community relationships affect seed selection decisions in ways that reflect the complex social dynamics of medieval village life. Families with diverse grain crops sometimes negotiate trades that allow each household to specialize in particular varieties while maintaining access to dietary diversity. Your family might trade some of your barley seed for your neighbour's wheat seed, allowing both families to optimise their planting strategies while sharing risk. These negotiations require careful consideration of relative grain values, storage capabilities, and each family's specific survival needs. The psychological aspects of seed selection create stress that extend well beyond practical considerations. Choosing to consume seed grain represents a decision to abandon hope for next year's crop, essentially betting everything on surviving winter and finding alternative solutions for next year's food production. Conversely, saving too much grain for seed, while family members suffer from malnutrition, creates immediate moral and emotional consequences that affect family relationships and community standing. The weight of making choices that determine not just survival, but the very possibility of future recovery creates pressure that few modern people ever experience. You venture deeper into the woodlands than ever before, your worn leather boots crunching through fallen leaves as you search for sustenance that your ancestors knew by heart, but modern people have largely forgotten. Forest foraging becomes not just a supplement to your dwindling grain stores, but a primary survival strategy that requires intimate knowledge of plants, fungi and tree products that can fill empty bellies when conventional agriculture fails. The medieval forest represents far more than a collection of trees. It's a complex ecosystem offering dozens of edible resources for those who possess the knowledge to find and prepare them safely. The morning mist clings to the forest floor as you make your way along paths that deer and wild boar have worn through the underbrush. Your grandmother's voice echoes in your memory as you identify plants and trees that could mean the difference between life and death. She taught you that the forest provides food throughout most of the year for those who know where to look, though autumn offers the greatest abundance of nuts, berries, and roots that can be preserved for winter consumption. Today, with winter approaching and your grain stores nearly exhausted, this knowledge becomes more precious than any material inheritance. Acorns represent one of the most abundant and nutritious foods available in temperate forests, though preparing them for human consumption requires techniques that most modern people would find laborious and time-consuming. You gather baskets full of these nuts, selecting the plumpest specimens while avoiding those with holes that indicate insect infestation. The bitter tannins that make raw acorns inedible must be leached out through repeated soaking and rinsing, a process that can take several days but transforms the nuts into a protein-rich flour that can be ground and mixed with other ingredients to create a form of bread. Beech nuts provide another crucial forest resource, offering a sweet, oily meat that requires no processing beyond cracking the small triangular shells. The trees don't produce abundant nut crops every year. Foresters call it mast years when conditions combine to create exceptional yields. But this autumn has blessed your region with a particularly heavy beechnut harvest. You compete with squirrels, mice, and wild boar for these nuts, working quickly to gather them before other creatures claim the windfall. A single day's collecting can provide several weeks' worth of supplemental nutrition for your family. Hazelnuts ripen earlier than acorns and beechnuts, offering the first significant tree nut harvest of autumn. These familiar nuts require minimal processing and store well when properly dried, making them ideal for winter preservation. You learned to identify hazel groves during summer when the trees display their distinctive catkins, marking locations to revisit during harvest season. Wild hazelnuts tend to be smaller than their cultivated cousins, but often possess more concentrated flavours and higher nutritional density. Tree bark represents one of the most unusual foods that desperate times force you to consider. Not all tree bark is edible. Some species contain toxic compounds that can cause serious illness, but certain varieties provide emergency nutrition when properly prepared. Pine bark, particularly the inner bark of young trees, can be dried and ground into a flour-like substance that extends bread recipes when grain supplies run low. Birch bark offers a slightly sweet flavour when the cambium layer is carefully harvested and processed, though the tree must be damaged in ways that might kill it, making bark harvesting a strategy of last resort. Wild roots and tubers scattered throughout the forest floor provide carbohydrates that can substitute for grain in emergency situations. Jerusalem artichokes, wild onions, and various lily bulbs store energy in underground structures that remain available even after the above-ground portions of plants have died back for winter. Digging these roots requires considerable effort and produces relatively small quantities of food, but during famine years, every calorie becomes precious. You must be absolutely certain of plant identification when harvesting wild roots, as many edible varieties have toxic lookalikes that can cause serious poisoning. Mushroom and fungi foraging presents both tremendous opportunities and significant dangers for desperate families seeking forest foods. Edible varieties like oyster mushrooms, honey mushrooms, and various belletates provide protein and essential nutrients that are often lacking in grain-based diets. However, mushroom identification requires expertise that takes years to develop safely, and the consequences of mistakes can be fatal. Even experienced foragers approach wild mushroom consumption with caution, testing small quantities of unfamiliar varieties before incorporating them into family meals. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants possessed sophisticated knowledge of mycology, or whether they simply avoided wild mushrooms altogether due to the risks involved. But evidence suggests that experienced rural families did maintain traditions of safe mushroom foraging passed down through generations. Your own knowledge comes from years of accompanying village elders during their forest expeditions. Learning to identify safe varieties through careful observation and gradual accumulation of experience rather than through formal instruction. Wild berries and fruits extend the forest's bounty well into autumn, providing essential vitamins and natural sugars that help combat the health effects of grain-based diets. Rose hips, those bright red fruits that develop after wild roses finish blooming, contain more vitamin C than citrus fruits and can be dried for winter storage or processed into preserves that last for months. Elderberries, hawthorn berries, and various wild grapes offer different nutritional profiles and preservation possibilities, allowing you to diversify your family's diet even during the most challenging times. The seasonal timing of forest foraging requires careful planning and intimate knowledge of each species' ripening schedule. Some nuts and fruits reach peak quality during narrow windows that might last only a few weeks, making it essential to monitor forest conditions throughout the growing season and harvest each resource at optimal times. Missing the peak harvest period for any particular species could mean losing access to that food source for an entire year, potentially creating nutritional gaps that affect your family's health and survival prospects. Preservation techniques for forest foods involve methods that maximize nutritional retention while ensuring safe storage through winter months. Nuts require thorough drying to prevent mold and rancidity, often followed by storage in containers that protect them from rodents and insects. Berries can be dried, made into preserves, or fermented into beverages that provide both nutrition and calories. Roots and bark must be processed quickly after harvest to maintain their nutritional value and prevent spoilage that could waste precious resources. Competition with wildlife adds complexity to forest foraging strategies during famine years. Wild animals face the same resource scarcity that affects human populations, creating increased pressure on forest food sources. Bears, deer, wild boar, and smaller mammals all depend on nuts, berries, and roots for their own winter survival, meaning that human foragers must work quickly and efficiently to secure adequate supplies before wildlife claims the available resources. This competition sometimes leads to dangerous encounters with large animals that are also desperate for food. The social aspects of forest foraging reflect medieval community structures and resource-sharing traditions. Some forest areas belong to specific manors or are reserved for particular uses, like timber harvesting or hunting, limiting access for peasant families during normal times. However, famine years often create informal suspensions of these restrictions, as survival needs override normal property rights. Families sometimes coordinate their foraging efforts, sharing knowledge about productive locations and dividing harvesting responsibilities to maximize efficiency while minimizing conflicts. Tool requirements for effective forest foraging include simple implements that most peasant families already possess or can easily improvise. Baskets for collecting nuts and berries, digging sticks for unearthing roots, knives for bark harvesting, and bags for carrying supplies represent the basic equipment needed for successful forest expeditions. However, the most important tool for forest foraging is knowledge, the accumulated wisdom about plant identification, seasonal timing, preparation methods, and preservation techniques that transforms the forest from an intimidating wilderness into a life-sustaining resource that could mean the difference between your family's survival and starvation during the long winter months ahead. You watch the great wooden wheel of the village mill remain motionless, its massive stones silent for the first time in your memory, as the failing grain supplies force entire communities to abandon traditional bread making and seek alternatives that would have seemed unthinkable during prosperous years. The mill that once formed the beating heart of your village's daily rhythm now stands as a monument to abundance lost. Its water wheel creaking occasionally in the autumn wind, but no longer turning with the purposeful energy that transformed raw grain into the flour that sustained hundreds of families. The miller, a man whose status in the community once rivaled that of the priest and the Lord's steward, now faces the same desperate calculations that plague every household. His profession depends entirely on villagers bringing grain to be ground into flour, taking his customary portion as payment for the service. When families possess barely enough grain to survive, the luxury of having it professionally ground becomes impossible to afford. The miller must choose between grinding tiny quantities for individual families, work that barely justifies firing up the massive millstones, or closing his operation entirely until better times return. Medieval bread production requires far more resources than simply grain and water. The village oven, built from stone and clay with careful attention to heat retention and airflow, consumes enormous quantities of firewood each time it's heated to baking temperature. During normal years, families coordinate their baking schedules to maximize the oven's efficiency, with each household contributing fuel and taking turns using the heated chamber. But when grain becomes scarce and firewood must be conserved for heating homes through winter, the communal oven sits cold and empty, its arched opening gaping like a hungry mouth that can no longer be fed. The absence of regular bread baking disrupts village life in ways that extend far beyond simple nutrition. Bread serves as more than food in medieval society. It represents community cooperation, social hierarchy, and religious significance that permeates daily existence. The Lord's Prayer itself acknowledges bread as fundamental to human survival, and the Christian symbolism surrounding bread makes its absence feel like spiritual as well as physical deprivation. When families can no longer produce their weekly loaves, They lose connection to rhythms of community life that have structured rural existence for generations. You remember how the mill used to operate during abundant years, with farmers arriving daily carrying sacks of grain to be transformed into flour. The miller would adjust the distance between the grinding stones based on the type of grain and the fineness of flour desired, creating everything from coarse meal suitable for animal feed to fine white flour reserved for special occasions and wealthy households. The sound of grain cascading between the stones, the rumble of the water wheel, and the conversations of waiting farmers created a constant backdrop of productive activity that demonstrated the community's prosperity and stability. Alternative food preparation methods become essential when traditional milling and baking systems fail. Families resort to hand-grinding grain using quernstones, small portable mills that consist of two circular stones operated by human power rather than water or wind. These domestic grinding tools require tremendous physical effort to produce even small quantities of flour, and the resulting meal tends to be coarser and less digestible than professionally milled flour. A single family's daily flour needs might require hours of grinding by hand, adding exhausting labour to days already filled with survival activities. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants routinely used hand-grinding methods or whether they depended almost entirely on communal mills, but archaeological evidence suggests that most households possessed some form of domestic grain processing capability for emergency use. Your family's quernstones, stored in the cottage's corner for most of the year, now become daily necessities as you struggle to transform your dwindling grain supplies into something resembling bread. The repetitive motion of grinding wears on muscles unaccustomed to this type of work, and the inefficiency of the process means that more grain is required to produce the same amount of flour. Without access to proper milling, many families turn to alternative preparation methods that bypass the need for flour entirely. Whole grains can be boiled into porridges that provide adequate nutrition while requiring less processing than bread production. Barley, oats, and wheat can all be prepared as thick gruels that fill empty stomachs and provide energy for daily labour. These porridge-based meals lack the cultural significance and satisfying texture of bread, but they offer efficient ways to extract maximum nutrition from limited grain supplies while conserving the fuel that would otherwise be needed for bread baking. The social implications of mill closures extend throughout the complex web of relationships that bind medieval communities together. Mills often serve as gathering places where farmers exchange information about weather, crops, market conditions, and local events. When the mills fall apart, these informal communication networks break down, leaving families more isolated and less informed about conditions in neighbouring areas. The miller himself, traditionally a source of news and gossip from across the region, loses his central role in community information sharing. Economic relationships centred around mill operations also collapse when grain becomes too scarce to support regular milling activities. Millers typically maintain complex arrangements with local farmers, accepting payment in grain, providing credit during difficult periods, and sometimes investing in agricultural improvements that benefit entire communities. These economic partnerships disappear when there's simply no grain to be milled, forcing both millers and farmers to seek alternative sources of income and support that may not exist in sufficient quantities to sustain traditional village economies. The technical aspects of mill maintenance become problematic when operations cease for extended periods. Water-powered mills require constant attention to keep their mechanical systems functioning properly, with regular lubrication of wooden gears, adjustment of stone spacing, and repair of better channels that direct flow to the wheel. When mills stand idle for months, these systems deteriorate rapidly, meaning that even when grain becomes available again, the infrastructure needed to process it may require extensive repairs that communities may lack the resources to afford. Religious and cultural traditions associated with bread production suffer when mills and ovens fall silent. Many medieval celebrations involve special breads baked for feast days, holy days, and seasonal festivals. Wedding ceremonies traditionally include bread-sharing rituals that symbolize the union of families and the hope for future prosperity. Funeral customs often involve distributing bread to mourners as a gesture of community support and remembrance. When bread production becomes impossible, these traditions must be modified or abandoned entirely, creating cultural losses that accompany the physical hardships of famine. The absence of freshly baked bread affects family relationships and household dynamics in subtle but significant ways. The daily rhythm of bread preparation, mixing dough, kneading, rising, baking, provides structure to domestic life and creates opportunities for teaching children essential skills they'll need as adults. Mothers traditionally pass bread-making knowledge to daughters through hands-on experience that builds family bonds while transmitting practical wisdom. When bread baking stops, these intergenerational learning opportunities disappear, potentially creating gaps in traditional knowledge that could affect future generations' survival capabilities. Alternative baking methods emerge as families adapt to the absence of communal ovens and professional milling services. Flatbreads that require less fuel and can be cooked on iron griddles over open fires become more common. Though they provide less nutrition per unit of grain than traditional leavened breads. Some families experiment with ash baking, burying dough in hot coals to create crude loaves that require no formal oven. These improvised baking techniques produce food that barely resembles traditional bread but provides essential calories when conventional methods become impossible to maintain. The psychological impact of losing access to fresh bread extends beyond simple dietary concerns to touch fundamental aspects of what makes life feel normal and civilized. Bread represents stability, community cooperation, and connection to cultural traditions that define medieval rural identity. When the mills stand silent and the ovens grow cold, families face not just hunger, but a profound disruption of the social and cultural frameworks that usually provide meaning and structure to daily existence during even the most challenging times. You clutch your family's most precious possessions as you make your way to the village market, knowing that today you must barter away items that carry decades of memories and sentimental value in exchange for the possibility of survival through another week. Trading desperation for hope becomes a cruel mathematics where wedding rings, hand-carved tools, and treasured heirlooms must be weighed against the immediate need for food, fuel, or other essential resources that might keep your family alive until spring arrives with its promise of renewal and recovery. The market square that once buzzed with cheerful commerce now carries an atmosphere of barely controlled panic as dozens of families arrive carrying similar bundles of possessions they never imagined selling. The normal rhythms of medieval trade, where surplus agricultural products and craft goods changed hands in relatively predictable patterns, have been replaced by desperate exchanges driven entirely by survival needs. Vendors who typically offered luxury items, imported goods, or specialized services now find themselves competing with ordinary villagers selling everything they own. Your hands shake slightly as you unwrap the small collection of items you've selected for trade. Each piece represents a decision that weighs immediate necessity against irreplaceable personal history. The bronze buckle that belonged to your grandfather, worn smooth by decades of daily use, might fetch enough grain to feed your family for several days. The carved wooden spoon your wife received as a wedding gift, polished to a warm glow through years of careful use, could purchase firewood that will keep your cottage warm through the coldest winter nights. The merchants and traders who still operate during famine years understand the dynamics of desperation with calculating precision. They know that families will accept almost any price for essential goods when starvation threatens, creating opportunities for profit that would be impossible during normal times. A single bushel of grain that might have cost a few copper coins during abundant harvests now commands prices equivalent to valuable livestock or precious metal items. The merchants don't necessarily enjoy taking advantage of desperate circumstances, but survival economics leave little room for sentiment or charity. You observe the other families around you making similar agonizing decisions about which possessions to sacrifice for their immediate needs. A young mother negotiates frantically to trade her wedding dress for a small sack of dried peas, her voice carrying the strain of someone who knows she's trading away a piece of her identity for a few more meals. An elderly craftsman examines his collection of fine tools, each one representing years of skill development and professional pride, trying to determine which implements he can afford to lose while still maintaining some capability to earn income. The social dynamics of famine markets create uncomfortable tensions that challenge normal community relationships. Neighbours who typically support each other during difficult times now find themselves competing for the same scarce resources, bidding against people they've known and trusted for years. The informal networks of mutual aid that usually sustain village communities during minor crises become strained when everyone faces the same fundamental shortage of food and other necessities. Livestock sales represent some of the most heartbreaking transactions occurring in famine markets. Families who have raised animals from birth, creatures that provided daily sustenance through milk, eggs, or occasional meat, must now choose between feeding their animals through winter or converting them immediately into resources that might sustain human family members. A productive milk cow that represents years of careful breeding and feeding decisions must be sold for whatever price desperate circumstances will allow, often far below the animal's true value to the family's long-term survival prospects. Children's possessions enter the marketplace as families exhaust adult resources and turn to items that represent hope for the next generation's future. Toys, small tools designed for teaching agricultural skills, and even children's clothing become tradable commodities when hunger overrides all other considerations. Parents make these trades with visible anguish, understanding that they're not just selling objects but potentially compromising their children's development and future opportunities in ways that might affect family prospects for years beyond the current crisis. Historians still argue whether medieval famine markets represented efficient resource allocation or predatory exploitation of vulnerable populations. But from your perspective as someone desperate to feed your family, the economic theory matters less than the immediate reality of finding someone willing to accept your possessions in exchange for food. The market operates according to supply and demand principles that seem almost cruelly mathematical when applied to human survival needs, creating situations where people trade away items worth months of normal income for resources that will sustain life for only days or weeks. Religious items present particularly difficult decisions for families facing starvation. Crosses, prayer books, and other objects connected to spiritual life carry significance that extends far beyond their material value, representing connections to faith traditions that provide comfort and meaning during the most challenging times. Yet these same items often command high prices from merchants who understand their importance to desperate families, or who can resell them to wealthy collectors in distant regions where famine hasn't created similar desperation. The timing of market transactions becomes crucial as families try to maximize the value of their possessions while minimizing the time they spend without essential resources. Items sold too early in the crisis might fetch better prices, but leave families without resources to trade if conditions worsen. Possessions held too long might lose value as more families flood the market with similar goods, creating surplus supplies that drive down prices for everything except the most essential commodities. Women's possessions often carry different significance and market value than a men's item, reflecting the gendered nature of medieval economic relationships. Jewellery, textiles, and household implements associated with domestic production might command higher prices from certain buyers, but they also represent skills and capabilities that women need to maintain household functions during crisis periods. Trading away spinning wheels, looms, or cooking implements might provide immediate resources, but could compromise a family's ability to produce necessary goods independently. Craftsmen face particularly complex decisions about which tools and materials to trade during famine years. Professional implements represent not just monetary value, but also the capability to earn income through skilled labour that might become crucial for long-term recovery. A blacksmith who trades away his anvil and hammers might survive the immediate crisis but loses the ability to practice his craft when economic conditions improve. These trade-offs between immediate survival and future earning potential require careful calculation about the likely duration and severity of the current emergency. Seasonal considerations affect trading strategies as families anticipate their resource needs throughout the remaining winter and into spring planting season. Items that might be valuable for surviving winter cold become less important as spring approaches, while tools and materials needed for agricultural preparation gain significance as planting time draws near. Successful trading requires understanding not just current market conditions, but also predicting how resource needs and availability will change as the seasonal cycle progresses. The emotional toll of trading away family possessions extends beyond simple material loss to affect family relationships and personal identity in profound ways. Objects that carried stories, memories, and connection to deceased relatives disappear from daily life, leaving gaps that may never be filled, even if prosperity returns. Children who watch their parents trade away familiar household items experience lessons about survival priorities that may influence their attitudes toward material possessions and family security for the rest of their lives. Geographic factors influence trading opportunities as families consider whether to sell possessions locally or attempt to reach markets in other communities where conditions might be different. Travelling to distant markets requires resources and involves risks, but it might also provide access to buyers who can offer better prices or different types of goods in exchange. These trading expeditions become calculated gambles where families risk losing everything they own for the possibility of finding better trading opportunities elsewhere. You wake in the depths of winter to a cold that seems to penetrate not just your bones but your very soul. As the hunger moon rises over a landscape stripped bare of comfort and plenty, the darkest months have arrived, and your stored food has dwindled to portions so meagre that each meal becomes a careful calculation of survival mathematics. Your body begins showing the unmistakable signs of malnutrition, the hollow cheeks, the way your clothes hang loose on a frame that seems to shrink a little more each day, the strange lightness in your head that makes simple tasks require tremendous concentration and effort. The medieval understanding of hunger differs fundamentally from modern concepts of food insecurity. You're not simply missing meals or reducing portion sizes. You're experiencing the systematic breakdown of your body's ability to function normally as it begins consuming its own muscle tissue and fat reserves to maintain essential biological processes. Your children's laughter comes less frequently now, replaced by a listless quiet that speaks of bodies conserving energy for basic survival rather than the exuberant players that characterizes healthy childhood. Sleep becomes both refuge and torment during these darkest weeks. Your dreams fill with elaborate feasts, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, wheels of cheese, and tankards of ale that seem so ill you can taste them upon waking. These nocturnal visions provide temporary escape from hunger's constant gnawing presence, but they also create a cruel contrast with the reality of empty cooking pots and bare cupboards that greets you each morning. The psychological aspects of prolonged hunger begin affecting your ability to think clearly, plan effectively, and maintain the emotional stability necessary for family leadership. Your wife moves through daily routines with the careful deliberation of someone whose body no longer possesses the energy reserve for unnecessary motion. Every action must be calculated against its energy cost, creating a strange sort of efficiency where tasks that once seemed simple now require planning and conservation of strength. Hauling water from the well, gathering firewood, or even preparing the tiny meals that represent your family's daily sustenance become significant undertakings that leave her exhausted for hours afterward. The children adapt to hunger with the resilience that both amazes and heartbreaks you. They learn to ignore the constant ache in their stomachs, to move more slowly and deliberately to conserve energy, to find entertainment in activities that require minimal physical exertion. Their growth essentially stops during these months of severe food restriction, and you understand with painful clarity that even if abundance returns, the effects of this hunger will mark their bodies and possibly their development for years to come. Firewood becomes almost as precious as food during these winter months, creating additional survival calculations that compete with nutritional needs for your family's limited resources. Every log burned for warmth represents potential trading value that could be exchanged for food. Yet without adequate heat, your family faces the additional threat of freezing to death, even if you manage to avoid starvation. You learn to build fires that provide maximum warmth with minimum fuel consumption, banking coals carefully through the night and timing heat production to coincide with the coldest periods. The social fabric of your village begins showing strain as individual families turn inward to focus on their own survival. Neighbours who typically share resources and labour during difficult times become more guarded about their possessions, more calculating about their generosity. Children who normally play together across family boundaries now remain closer to home, as parents become protective of the energy their offspring need to conserve for survival. Community gatherings that usually provide social connection and mutual support occur less frequently, as people lack the energy and resources for social activities. Historians still argue whether medieval communities maintained their cooperative traditions during severe famines, or whether survival pressures inevitably led to social breakdown. But your experience suggests a more complex reality where cooperation and competition exist simultaneously. Some families continue sharing what little they have with neighbours in need, understanding that community survival ultimately supports individual family prospects. Other families retreat into protective isolation, hoarding every scrap of food and fuel against an uncertain future that might require all their resources for their own survival. The physical symptoms of malnutrition progress in predictable stages that medieval people understood through bitter experience even without modern medical knowledge. Initial hunger gives way to weakness and fatigue, followed by changes in skin color and texture, hair loss, and increased susceptibility to minor illnesses that healthy bodies would easily resist. Your family members begin experiencing dental problems as nutritional deficiencies affect their ability to maintain basic health, and minor injuries heal more slowly than normal, creating additional vulnerabilities during an already dangerous time. Religious observances take on intensified meaning during these months of extremity, as prayers for deliverance from hunger become more urgent and personal than any spiritual practices you've previously experienced. The village priest, himself showing signs of inadequate nutrition, leads services that focus increasingly on themes of suffering, endurance, and faith in divine providence that will eventually restore abundance to the faithful. These religious gatherings provide some comfort and community connection, but they also serve as stark reminders of how many familiar faces have disappeared from regular attendance. The winter landscape mirrors your family's internal condition, with a barren beauty that feels both peaceful and threatening. Snow covers the fields where next year's crops will hopefully grow, creating a clean, white surface that hides the reality of soil exhausted by failed harvests and inadequate fertilization. The forest stands silent except for wind through bare branches, its wildlife also struggling with food scarcity that affects the entire regional ecosystem. Even the streams move more slowly, their edges frozen in ways that make water collection more difficult and time-consuming. Medieval understanding of seasonal depression overlaps with the physical effects of malnutrition in ways that create compounding challenges for mental and emotional health. The combination of reduced daylight, inadequate nutrition, and constant survival stress affects mood, cognitive function, and family relationships in ways that test even the strongest bonds. Patience becomes a luxury that requires energy you don't possess, leading to tensions and conflicts that would normally be easily resolved through compromise and understanding. Your daily routines contract to focus on the most essential activities required for immediate survival. Morning begins with carefully rationing the tiny portions of food that represent breakfast, followed by assessment of fuel supplies, weather conditions, and any opportunities for gathering additional resources. Afternoon activities might include searching for overlooked food sources, maintaining minimal household functions, or engaging in small-scale trade activities that could provide additional sustenance. Evening brings the challenge of preparing dinner from ingredients so limited that the meal barely deserves the name, followed by early sleep that conserves energy and provides escape from hunger's constant presence. The economic relationships that normally govern village life become distorted during these months of scarcity, as traditional exchanges of goods and services break down when nobody possesses surplus resources to trade. Craftsmen who normally barter their skills for agricultural products find little demand for non-essential services when everyone focuses on basic survival. Agricultural labourers discover that farmers lack the resources to pay for help, even when work needs to be done. These disruptions to normal economic patterns create additional uncertainties about how community relationships will function when abundance eventually returns. Time perception changes during prolonged periods of hunger and hardship, with days feeling simultaneously endless and fleeting as your consciousness narrows to focus on immediate survival needs rather than longer-term planning or abstract concerns. The normal markers of seasonal progression, holidays, market days, religious observances, lose some of their significance when every day presents the same fundamental challenge of finding enough resources to sustain life for another 24 hours. Yet paradoxically, you also become acutely aware of seasonal changes that might signal approaching relief. watching for the subtle signs that winter is beginning its slow retreat towards spring's eventual promise of renewal. You discover which neighbours share their last loaves and which ones hoard, as the social fabric of your village stretches thin under the relentless pressure of genuine scarcity that tests every relationship, every assumption about community solidarity, and every belief about human nature when survival hangs in the balance. The crisis reveals character in ways that prosperity never could, stripping away the comfortable social conventions that normally mask people's true priorities and showing you exactly who can be trusted when life itself depends on mutual support and cooperation. The widow who lives 3 cottages down from your family becomes an unexpected source of generosity, appearing at your door on the coldest mornings with small portions of soup made from bones she's boiled multiple times to extract every trace of nutrition. Her own situation is desperate. A woman alone with 2 young children has few resources and limited ability to gather food or fuel, yet she consistently finds ways to share what little she possesses with families she perceives as even more vulnerable than her own. Her actions demonstrate the kind of selfless community spirit that medieval social structures supposedly encourage, but that you now realize requires extraordinary personal courage to maintain during genuine crises. Conversely, the prosperous farmer whose fields border your own reveals a calculating selfishness that shocks you with its cold precision. You've known this man since childhood, shared harvest labour with him during abundant years, and always considered him a reliable neighbour whose success benefited the entire community. But when hunger begins affecting everyone, he transforms into someone barely recognisable, hoarding grain while his neighbours starve, charging exorbitant prices for minimal quantities of food, and showing no concern for community members who helped him during previous difficulties. The village baker, whose profession should make him central to community food distribution, faces impossible choices that highlight the moral complexities of famine economics. His remaining flour supplies could produce perhaps 20 loaves of bread, enough to provide meaningful nutrition for several families, but insufficient to address the needs of everyone seeking help. Should he distribute tiny portions equally among all who ask, ensuring that everyone receives something but that no one gets enough to make a real difference? Or should he concentrate his limited resources on a few families, potentially saving some lives while watching others starve? These decisions would challenge any ethical framework, and you watch him age visibly as he struggles with choices that have no clearly correct answers. Medieval social hierarchies complicate community responses to famine in ways that challenge traditional assumptions about feudal obligations and mutual support. The lord of your manor faces his own version of resource allocation dilemmas, possessing stores that could temporarily alleviate suffering, but that might also be needed to maintain his household, support his military obligations, and preserve his ability to govern effectively. His decisions about when and how to share resources affect dozens of families, creating political and economic pressures that extend far beyond simple humanitarian concerns. Religious leaders struggle to provide both spiritual comfort and practical guidance during times when theological concepts of divine providence seem disconnected from the harsh realities of watching children starve, despite faithful prayer and religious observance. The village priest experiences his own crisis of faith as he attempts to reconcile teachings about God's benevolence with the suffering he witnesses daily among his most devout parishioners. His sermons begin emphasizing themes of testing, endurance, and eventual reward that feel increasingly hollow as the crisis deepens and no relief appears on the horizon. Children's relationships reflect adult tensions, while also demonstrating remarkable adaptability to circumstances that would devastate less resilient individuals. Young people who normally play together across family lines begin forming tighter bonds with siblings and cousins, understanding instinctively that family loyalty provides the most reliable source of support during uncertain times. Yet they also develop new friendships based on shared survival activities, foraging expeditions, fuel gathering, and collaborative efforts to find food sources that adults might overlook. Women's networks, typically centered around shared domestic responsibilities and child-rearing activities, become crucial sources of information, emotional support, and practical cooperation during famine conditions. Mothers share knowledge about food preservation, alternative cooking methods, and strategies for maintaining family health under starvation conditions. These informal communication systems often prove more effective than official channels for spreading news about resource availability, trading opportunities, and survival techniques that could make the difference between life and death for struggling families. Historians still argue whether medieval communities possessed formal mechanisms for managing famine relief, or whether responses developed spontaneously based on traditional obligations and personal relationships, but your experience suggests that both structured and improvised systems operate simultaneously. Some relief efforts follow established patterns of feudal responsibility and religious charity, while others emerge from individual initiative and community innovation that adapts to circumstances no one anticipated when social structures were originally established. The psychology of sharing during extreme scarcity reveals fundamental aspects of human nature that remain hidden during prosperous times. Families who possess even slightly more resources than their neighbours face constant pressure to provide help that could compromise their own survival prospects. The decision to share or withhold resources creates moral burdens that affect personal relationships long after the immediate crisis passes. People remember who helped and who refused to help with a clarity that normal social interactions rarely achieve. Trade relationships within the community become increasingly complex as traditional exchange systems break down under the pressure of universal scarcity. The blacksmith who normally accepts agricultural products in payment for his services now demands immediate compensation in food or fuel that farmers simply don't possess. These disruptions to normal economic patterns create cascading effects that reduce everyone's access to essential goods and services, even when the technical capability to provide them still exists. Violence remains relatively rare during your village's famine experience, but tensions occasionally explode into confrontations that would never occur during normal times. Disputes over property boundaries, accusations of theft, and disagreements about resource allocation sometimes escalate beyond verbal arguments to physical confrontations that require community intervention. The absence of adequate nutrition affects judgment and emotional control in ways that make conflict resolution more difficult and potentially more dangerous than usual. Gender roles shift subtly as survival pressures override traditional social conventions about appropriate activities for men and women. Mothers become more aggressive in seeking resources for their children, venturing into areas and engaging in activities that would normally be considered inappropriate for women. Fathers spend more time on domestic tasks like food preparation and childcare as their wives focus on foraging, trading, and other survival activities that require skills traditionally associated with female responsibilities. Intergenerational relationships experience particular strain as older community members struggle with physical limitations that make them less capable of contributing to family survival efforts while still requiring scarce resources for their own sustenance. These difficult situations force families to make heartbreaking decisions about resource allocation that challenge fundamental values about respect for elders and family obligations. Some families maintain their commitment to caring for aging relatives regardless of cost, while others make more calculating choices based purely on survival mathematics. The village's physical appearance reflects the social changes occurring within the community as families abandon non-essential activities to focus entirely on immediate survival needs. Gardens that normally receive careful maintenance throughout winter lie neglected. Buildings that would typically receive regular repair work develop problems that go unaddressed. And public spaces that usually serve as gathering places become empty as people conserve energy for essential activities. The visible deterioration of the community's infrastructure parallels the social relationships that bind people together. Leadership patterns emerge organically, as some individuals demonstrate exceptional capability for organizing survival efforts, mediating disputes, and maintaining community morale during the darkest periods. These emerging leaders don't necessarily correspond to the traditional authorities' structures, as survival crises reward practical skills, emotional stability, and genuine concern for community welfare rather than inherited status or accumulated wealth. You watch new alliances form around these capable individuals, while traditional power relationships weaken under the pressure of circumstances that traditional leaders seem unable to address effectively. You face impossible tax demands from nobles who refuse to acknowledge the crisis affecting their lands, creating a confrontation between feudal obligations and survival reality that tests the very foundations of medieval social order. The Lord's steward arrives at your cottage door with the same imperious demeanour he's always displayed, carrying scrolls that detail tax assessments calculated as if this were a normal year of abundant harvest rather than a time when families struggle to find enough food to survive another day. The feudal system that normally governs your relationship with the nobility assumes a productive agricultural economy where peasant families generate surplus crops, livestock, and labour that can be transferred upward through the social hierarchy in exchange for protection, land use rights, and basic security. But famine years shatter these assumptions, creating situations where the normal flow of resources from peasants to lords becomes impossible to maintain without literally starving the people who form the foundation of the entire economic structure. You stand in your cottage doorway, acutely aware of your family's hollow cheeks and the empty grain chest that mocks any pretense of being able to meet traditional tax obligations. The steward's demands seem to come from a different world, one where agricultural abundance still exists, and where peasant families possess surplus resources that can be extracted without threatening basic survival. His inability to recognize or acknowledge the reality of famine conditions reflects the insulation that wealth and status provide from the immediate consequences of agricultural failure. Medieval tax collection typically involves multiple overlapping obligations that create complex burdens even during prosperous years. You owe grain payments, labour service, monetary taxes, and various fees that supposedly compensate the lord for protection, judicial services, and land access. During normal times, these obligations consume perhaps 1/3 of your family's total production, leaving adequate resources for survival while supporting the elaborate social structure that maintains order and stability throughout the region. The mathematics of taxation during famine becomes starkly impossible as demands remain constant while production approaches zero. If you somehow manage to meet all traditional tax obligations this year, your family would literally starve to death before spring arrives. Yet refusal to pay taxes carries consequences that could be equally fatal: loss of land use rights, imprisonment, physical punishment, or expulsion from the community that provides your only source of security and support. The Lord's household continues operating as if abundance were universal, maintaining elaborate to feasts, supporting large retinues of servants and soldiers, and pursuing expensive projects that demonstrate wealth and power to neighbouring nobles. From your perspective as someone rationing individual grains of wheat to extend survival for another few days, this continued luxury seems not just insensitive but actively malevolent. The contrast between noble abundance and peasant starvation creates resentments that challenge fundamental assumptions about social order and divine mandate that supposedly justify aristocratic privilege. Historians still argue whether medieval lords generally reduced tax burdens during famine years or whether they maintained extraction levels regardless of peasant suffering. But evidence suggests tremendous variation based on individual circumstances, local traditions, and the specific personalities of noble families. Some lords demonstrate genuine concern for their tenants' welfare, understanding that dead peasants provide no future tax revenue and that excessive extraction could destabilize their entire domain. Other nobles maintain their demands with ruthless consistency, viewing peasants' suffering as irrelevant to their own obligations and privileges. You attempt to negotiate with the steward, explaining your family's situation and requesting reduced obligations that might allow survival while still acknowledging feudal relationships. These conversations require careful diplomatic language that shows appropriate respect for authority while clearly communicating the impossibility of meeting normal demands. The steward listens with the polite attention of someone who has heard similar pleas from dozens of families, his responses indicating predetermined decisions rather than genuine consideration of individual circumstances. The village's collective response to tax pressure creates opportunities for solidarity that might not exist if families face these challenges individually. Groups of peasants sometimes coordinate their appeals, presenting unified requests for tax relief that carry more political weight than individual pleas. These collaborative efforts require careful organisation and shared risk-taking, as collective resistance could be interpreted as rebellion that brings severe punishment to entire communities. Alternative forms of payment become necessary when traditional tax obligations prove impossible to meet through normal channels. Labour service that might normally occupy a few days per month could be extended to consume weeks of work time, providing the lord with increased services while allowing peasant families to meet their obligations without surrendering food resources they need for survival. However, extended labour obligations create their own problems by reducing the time available for survival activities like foraging, fuel gathering, and food preparation. The timing of tax collection adds another layer of complexity to already impossible situations. Taxes traditionally come due after harvest, when peasant families should possess maximum resources from the year's agricultural production. During famine years, harvest time arrives with minimal crops and exhausted storage supplies, making it the worst possible moment for resource extraction. Yet feudal law typically provides no flexibility for payment timing, creating conflicts between legal obligations and physical survival that have no satisfactory resolution. Women's roles in tax negotiations reflect the complex gender dynamics of medieval society under stress. Wives often possess detailed knowledge of household resources and family survival strategies that makes them better equipped to discuss realistic payment possibilities than husbands who may be less familiar with domestic economics. However, social conventions typically require that men serve as primary negotiators with authority figures, creating situations where the most knowledgeable family members cannot directly participate in crucial decisions about resource allocation. Religious authorities sometimes intervene in tax disputes, providing mediation services that attempt to balance feudal obligations with Christian charity principles. The Church possesses its own tax collection responsibilities that compete with secular demands for peasant resources, creating additional complexity in communities where multiple authorities assert claims on the same limited supplies. Priests who advocate for reduced tax burdens risk conflicts with noble patrons who fund church operations and provide protection for religious institutions. Also, local enforcement of tax collection varies dramatically based on the personal characteristics of individual officials and the specific relationship between lords and their tenants. Some stewards employ violent intimidation tactics designed to extract maximum resources regardless of consequences for peasant families. Others pursue more diplomatic approaches that seek sustainable solutions, allowing continued tax collection while preserving the peasant population that generates future revenue. These different approaches create wildly different outcomes for families facing similar circumstances in neighbouring areas. The broader political implications of tax resistance during famine years extend beyond individual lord-peasant relationships to affect regional stability and royal authority. Widespread inability to meet tax obligations reduces the resources available to noble families for military service, infrastructure maintenance, and support of royal policies. These cascading effects can influence everything from defense capabilities to diplomatic relationships, making local famine conditions into matters of national political concern. Legal remedies for tax disputes exist within medieval judicial systems, but accessing these mechanisms requires resources and knowledge that most peasant families don't possess during normal times, much less during survival crises. Court proceedings involve fees, travel expense, and time commitments that become impossible burdens when families struggle to meet basic survival needs. The theoretical availability of legal protection means little when practical access remains beyond reach for the people who most need judicial intervention. Underground resistance to tax collection sometimes emerges when official channels provide no relief from impossible demands. Families might hide resources, underreport production levels, or coordinate deception strategies designed to reduce apparent wealth and ability to pay. These activities carry enormous risks if discovered, as tax evasion typically brings severe punishment that could destroy entire families. Yet when legal compliance means certain starvation, illegal resistance becomes a rational survival strategy regardless of potential consequences. You learn to make bread from acorns, sawdust, and anything remotely edible your ancestors never imagined consuming, as desperation transforms your kitchen into an experimental laboratory where creativity and necessity combine to produce sustenance that barely resembles food but might mean the difference between life and death for your starving family. The traditional recipes that guided your cooking throughout normal years become useless memories as you confront the challenge of creating nutrition from materials that would have been considered inedible during times of abundance. The process of making acorn flour requires knowledge and techniques that most families possess only in theoretical form, passed down through stories of previous famines rather than practical experience. You must first gather acorns in enormous quantities, recognizing that the labor-intensive processing method will reduce pounds of raw nuts to much smaller amounts of usable flour. The bitter tannins that make acorns inedible in their natural state must be leached out through repeated soaking and rinsing cycles that can take up to a week of constant attention and precious water resources. Your makeshift food preparation begins with crushing the acorns using whatever tools you can improvise. Stones from the riverbed that serve as grinding surfaces, wooden mallets carved from broken tool handles, or any heavy objects that can break tough shells and pulverize the meat inside. The physical effort required for hand processing acorns exhausts energy reserves that your malnourished body can barely spare, creating a cruel irony where preparing food burns almost as many calories as the resulting flour provides. Sawdust represents one of the most desperate ingredients that famine forces ordinary people to consider as potential food. Though the preparation methods required to make wood fibre digestible challenge both culinary skills and basic safety considerations, only certain types of wood can be safely consumed by humans, pine, birch, and aspen among them, while others contain toxic compounds that could cause serious poisoning. The sawdust must be boiled repeatedly to break down cellulose fibres and remove harmful substances, creating a process that consumes enormous quantities of fuel while producing questionable nutritional value. Tree bark becomes another crucial component of famine-bred recipes. Though harvesting bark presents its own complex challenges that require balancing immediate food needs against long-term environmental consequences, taking too much bark from any single tree will kill it, eliminating future sources of nuts, fruit, or additional bark that might be needed for survival. You learn to harvest bark strips carefully, taking only what the tree can survive while still providing meaningful quantities of edible material for your family's desperate needs. Medieval understanding of plant toxicity relies heavily on traditional knowledge passed down through generations of rural families, though famine conditions often force people to experiment with plant materials that fall outside established safety guidelines. You become acutely aware of the difference between plants that are merely unpalatable and those that could cause serious illness or death, testing small quantities of unfamiliar materials before incorporating them into family meals. The margin for error becomes terrifyingly small when food experimentation could either save your family or accidentally poison them. The texture and taste of famine bread challenges every assumption about what constitutes acceptable food, producing loaves that crumble like sawdust, taste bitter despite extensive processing, and provide minimal nutritional satisfaction despite representing hours of preparation work. Children who normally enjoy fresh bread as a highlight of daily meals must be coaxed and encouraged to consume these primitive substitutes that bear little resemblance to familiar foods. The psychological adjustment to eating materials that look, smell, and taste like construction materials rather than food creates additional stress for families already struggling with physical deprivation. Historians still argue whether medieval famine foods represented genuine nutritional strategies or desperate measures that provided minimal survival benefit while consuming valuable time and energy. But your experience suggests that any calories obtained through these methods contribute meaningfully to family survival, even when the food quality seems inadequate. The human body can extract nutrition from surprising sources when properly motivated by starvation, and even small amounts of additional calories can extend survival time significantly during severe food shortages. Root vegetables and tubers that would normally be reserved for animal feed become precious ingredients for human consumption during famine years, though preparing them safely requires techniques that differ significantly from normal cooking methods. Wild turnips, burdock roots, and other fibrous underground storage organs must be processed extensively to break down tough cellulose structures and neutralize compounds that could cause digestive problems. The preparation often involves multiple rounds of boiling, grinding, and mixing with other ingredients to create something approaching edible consistency. Leaf meals represent another category of famine food that requires specialized knowledge about which plant materials can safely supplement grain-based recipes. Young leaves from trees like linden, birch, and beech can be dried and ground into powder that adds bulk to bread recipes while providing trace nutrients that might be missing from grain-based diets. However, leaf collection must be timed carefully to harvest materials before they develop higher concentrations of tannins and other compounds that become problematic as leaves mature. The fermentation process becomes crucial for improving both the safety and digestibility of famine foods that would be difficult or dangerous to consume in their natural state. Extended fermentation can break down toxic compounds, improve nutritional availability, and create preservation effects that extend the useful life of processed foods. You learn to manage fermentation timing and conditions using traditional techniques adapted for unusual ingredients that respond differently than familiar grains and vegetables. Kitchen equipment designed for normal food preparation proves inadequate for processing the tough, fibrous materials that constitute famine foods, forcing families to improvise tools and techniques using whatever materials they can obtain or create. Grinding stones become essential for breaking down bark, nuts, and roots into forms that can be incorporated into bread recipes. Straining cloths help separate edible portions from indigestible fibers that could cause intestinal blockages if consumed. Multiple cooking pots allow for the extended boiling and processing cycles required to make unusual ingredients safe and palatable. Mixing ratios for famine bread require careful experimentation to achieve combinations that provide maximum nutrition while remaining consumable despite their unconventional ingredients. Too much sawdust creates bread that crumbles into inedible powder, while too much acorn flour produces loaves so bitter that even starving family members struggle to consume them. Finding the optimal balance between different substitute ingredients becomes an ongoing process of trial and error that wastes precious resources when experiments fail to produce edible results. Preservation techniques for famine foods must account for the unusual characteristics of ingredients that don't follow normal patterns of spoilage and deterioration. Bread made with high proportions of bark and sawdust tends to become mouldy more quickly than traditional grain breads, requiring different storage methods and consumption timing. However, some famine ingredients like properly processed acorn flour actually store better than wheat flour under certain conditions, providing unexpected advantages for families with limited storage capabilities. The social aspects of sharing famine food recipes create networks of information exchange that help families learn from each other's experiments and avoid dangerous mistakes that could prove fatal during periods when any food loss represents a serious survival threat. Women particularly share knowledge about processing techniques, cooking methods, and ingredient combinations that have proven successful or problematic. These informal communication systems become crucial for community survival as families collectively develop expertise in utilizing resources that previous generations rarely needed to consider. Children's adaptation to famine foods requires patient encouragement and creative presentation methods that help young family members accept nutrition sources that differ dramatically from their previous food experiences. Parents learn to emphasize the life-saving importance of consuming available foods while acknowledging the unpleasant taste and texture that make these meals psychologically difficult. The long-term effects of childhood famine food experiences often influence food preferences and attitudes toward waste throughout survivors' entire lifetimes, creating cultural changes that persist long after abundance returns. You watch famines, companion illnesses spread through your village while trying to keep your own family healthy, as disease stalks the weak with predatory precision that transforms hunger from a manageable hardship into a life-threatening crisis, affecting every aspect of community health and survival. The medieval understanding of illness during famine years recognizes the interconnected relationship between malnutrition and disease susceptibility. Though the specific mechanisms remain mysterious to people who lack modern medical knowledge about immune system function and nutritional deficiencies, scurvy appears first among the children, their gums becoming swollen and bleeding, while their teeth loosen in ways that make eating the already inadequate food supplies even more difficult and painful. You recognize the symptoms from stories passed down through generations of rural families, understanding that the absence of fresh fruits and vegetables creates this particular form of suffering that could be prevented if adequate nutrition were available. The irony of watching children develop dental problems when food scarcity already makes eating challenging adds another layer of cruelty to circumstances that seem designed to test human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Respiratory infections sweep through households with frightening efficiency as weakened immune systems prove unable to resist illnesses that healthy bodies would normally overcome with minimal difficulty. The combination of inadequate nutrition, poor heating, and cramped living conditions creates perfect circumstances for disease transmission, turning family closeness from a source of comfort into a vector for spreading illness that threatens everyone's survival. You listen to the constant coughing that echoes from neighbouring cottages, understanding that each sound represents another family member whose weakened condition makes recovery uncertain. The village-wise woman, whose knowledge of herbal remedies normally provides effective treatment for common ailments, finds her traditional healing methods inadequate when dealing with illnesses that stem from fundamental nutritional deficiencies rather than external infections or injuries. Her carefully maintained collection of medicinal plants can address symptoms, but cannot remedy the underlying starvation that makes people vulnerable to diseases they would normally resist. She adapts her treatments to focus on comfort and symptom management rather than cures that require resources no longer available. Dysentery becomes a constant threat as families consume foods of questionable safety and resort to water sources that might normally be considered too risky for human consumption. The digestive problems that result from eating famine foods compound existing malnutrition by reducing the body's ability to extract nutrition from whatever food remains available. You watch neighbours become trapped in cycles where inadequate food leads to digestive illness that further reduces their ability to benefit from the minimal nutrition they can obtain. Skin conditions develop as vitamin deficiencies and general malnutrition affect the body's largest organ, creating rashes, sores, and infections that resist healing when their immune system lacks resources for normal repair processes. These visible signs of nutritional deficiency serve as constant reminders of the crisis affecting everyone, making it impossible to ignore or minimize the health consequences of prolonged food scarcity. Children develop the telltale signs of pellagra and other deficiency diseases that mark their bodies with evidence of suffering that may persist long after adequate nutrition returns. Medieval medical theory attributes illness to imbalances in bodily humours rather than nutritional deficiencies or infectious agents, creating treatment approaches that sometimes worsen conditions they are intended to cure. The village physician, when one is available, might recommend bloodletting for patients whose weakness actually stems from anemia caused by inadequate nutrition. These well-intentioned treatments, based on incomplete understanding of disease causation, can accelerate decline in people whose bodies are already stressed beyond their normal capacity for recovery. Historians still argue whether medieval communities possessed effective strategies for managing disease outbreaks during famine years, or whether they simply accepted illness as an inevitable consequence of food scarcity. But evidence suggests that rural families developed practical approaches based on observation and experience rather than formal medical training. You learn to recognize early warning signs of serious illness and implement isolation procedures that might slow disease transmission, even when treatment options remain limited. Mental health effects accompany physical illness as prolonged stress, inadequate nutrition, and constant anxiety about survival create psychological conditions that medieval people understand as melancholy or madness, but cannot treat effectively. Family members who normally maintain emotional stability begin showing signs of depression, anxiety, and behavioural changes that strain household relationships during times when cooperation becomes essential for survival. The absence of adequate nutrition affects brain function in ways that compromise judgment, memory, and emotional regulation. Childhood diseases that would normally be minor inconveniences become life-threatening emergencies when young immune systems lack the nutritional support needed for the effective response to infection. Measles, whooping cough, and other common childhood ailments produce much higher mortality rates during famine years, creating heartbreaking situations where families watch children die from illnesses that would be easily survivable under normal circumstances. Parents make agonizing decisions about resource allocation between sick and healthy children, knowing that concentrating limited food on the healthiest family members might offer better overall survival prospects. The absence of adequate fuel for heating creates additional health challenges as families choose between staying warm and conserving resources that might be traded for food. Cold stress compounds the effects of malnutrition, while increasing caloric needs that cannot be met with available food supplies. You observe the careful calculations that neighbours make about heating priorities, warming only essential areas during the coldest periods while accepting uncomfortable temperatures that would normally be considered unacceptable. Pregnancy and childbirth during famine years create particularly tragic circumstances, as expectant mothers lack the nutritional resources needed for healthy fetal development and successful delivery. Women who become pregnant during the crisis face impossible choices about continuing pregnancies that might threaten their own survival, while potentially producing children who cannot be adequately nourished. The infant mortality rate increases dramatically as newborns enter a world where breast milk production suffers from maternal malnutrition and supplemental nutrition remains unavailable. Elderly community members experience disproportionate health effects as aging bodies prove less resilient when facing the combined stresses of inadequate nutrition, disease exposure, and harsh living conditions. Older adults who maintained independent lives during prosperous years require increasing care and support that strains family resources already stretched beyond their normal capacity. These situations force difficult decisions about resource allocation that challenge fundamental values about respect for elders and family obligations. Traditional food preservation and preparation methods must be modified to account for increased disease risks when families resort to marginal food sources that might harbour dangerous bacteria or parasites. Cooking techniques that adequately sterilize normal foods prove insufficient for materials harvested from questionable sources or stored under less than ideal conditions. You learn to extend cooking times and temperatures beyond normal requirements while balancing food safety against fuel conservation needs. Herbal medicine knowledge becomes more crucial than ever as families seek natural remedies for illnesses that cannot be treated through conventional medical channels. The village herbalist shares information about plants that might boost immune function, reduce inflammation, or provide pain relief using resources that can be gathered locally rather than purchased from distant sources. However, the effectiveness of these treatments depends partly on the patient's overall nutritional status, creating limitations when the underlying problem involves systemic starvation. Sanitation challenges increase as families conserve water for drinking and food preparation rather than cleaning, while waste disposal becomes more difficult when normal systems break down under crisis conditions. The accumulation of unsanitary conditions creates environments where disease transmission accelerates. making individual health dependent on community-wide hygiene practices that become harder to maintain when survival priorities shift toward immediate food and fuel needs rather than long-term health considerations. Community response to disease outbreaks requires coordination and resource sharing that becomes more difficult when every family focuses primarily on its own survival needs. Caring for sick neighbours traditionally represents an important aspect of rural community life. But famine conditions strain these mutual support systems as healthy family members cannot spare the time and energy required for extensive caregiving activities. The breakdown of normal social support mechanisms compounds the health crisis by leaving vulnerable individuals with reduced access to assistance that might improve their recovery prospects. You experience the agonizing wait for new growth when winter stores are exhausted but harvest remains months away, trapped in spring's cruel false promise that teases with hints of renewal while delivering nothing immediately edible to sustain your family through the most dangerous period of the entire famine year. The medieval agricultural calendar creates this predictable crisis point where stored food runs out just as nature begins showing signs of life, creating a gap between hope and reality that tests human endurance in ways that autumn's obvious scarcity cannot match. The first green shoots pushing through thawed soil should represent encouragement and optimism, but instead they mock your family's desperate hunger with promises that won't be fulfilled for months. Wild garlic and early dandelion greens provide tiny amounts of fresh nutrition after a winter of preserved foods and famine substitutes, but these small gifts from awakening nature offer hope rather than sustenance. Psychological relief rather than the calories needed to maintain life through the crucial weeks ahead. Your children's excitement at spotting the first crocuses and snowdrops breaks your heart as their innocent joy reminds you how many weeks must pass before edible plants produce enough growth to make meaningful contributions to family nutrition. They understand that spring means eventual plenty, but their young minds cannot fully grasp the temporal mathematics that makes this the most dangerous time of year for families whose winter stores have already been consumed and whose bodies have been weakened by months of inadequate nutrition. Medieval farming wisdom recognizes this period as the hunger gap, or starving time, acknowledging that even well-prepared families regularly face food scarcity during late winter and early spring, when stored supplies dwindle while new crops remain months away from harvest. During normal years, this seasonal challenge creates temporary hardship that families manage through careful rationing, community cooperation, and supplementation with early spring foraging. During famine years, the hunger gap becomes a death trap that claims the lives of people who survived winter's worst challenges only to perish when rescue seems finally within reach. The psychological toll of spring's false promise affects family relationships and community dynamics in ways that differ qualitatively from winter's obvious hardships. Winter hunger feels appropriate to the season, a harsh time that demands endurance and resignation. Spring hunger feels like cosmic cruelty, as if nature deliberately torments suffering people by displaying abundance that remains tantalizingly out of reach. You watch neighbours develop what medieval people call spring madness, a desperate restlessness that drives people to take increasingly dangerous risks in pursuit of food. Wild plant foraging becomes both more promising and more dangerous as early spring growth offers new possibilities alongside significant hazards for inexperienced gatherers. Young shoots and leaves that will eventually become safely edible often contain higher concentrations of toxic compounds during their early growth phases, making timing crucial for families desperate enough to experiment with marginal food sources. You learn to distinguish between plants that can be safely harvested in their early spring forms and those that require additional maturation before becoming suitable for human consumption. The village's collective mood shifts as families that maintained hope throughout winter's obvious challenges begin losing faith when spring's apparent promise fails to deliver immediate relief. Conversations that once focused on survival strategies and mutual support increasingly turn to questions about whether any of you will live to see actual harvest time. The social fabric that held the community together during winter's clear adversity begins fraying as spring reveals the extent to which individual families' resources have been exhausted. Livestock that survived winter in weakened condition face their own version of the spring gap as pastures remain too sparse to provide adequate nutrition, while stored fodder supplies reach exhaustion. You watch your neighbour's cow, a magnificent animal during prosperous years, become increasingly skeletal as she attempts to nurse a calf while lacking adequate nutrition for milk production. These animals represent crucial resources for community recovery, but keeping them alive through the spring gap requires resources that competing human needs make almost impossible to spare. Historians still argue whether medieval communities developed effective strategies for managing the spring hunger gap, or whether they simply accepted it as an inevitable consequence of agricultural timing. But evidence suggests that experienced rural families employed various techniques for extending food supplies and gathering early nutrition that could bridge the gap between winter storage and summer abundance. Your grandmother's knowledge of timing becomes invaluable as she guides foraging expeditions and teaches food preparation techniques designed specifically for early spring conditions. Seed grain allocation presents its most crucial test during the spring gap, when families must resist the overwhelming temptation to consume planting materials that represent hope for future harvest but could provide immediate relief from present starvation. Every kernel of saved wheat or barley becomes a choice between eating today and having crops next year, with the added complexity that planting season approaches rapidly, while family members grow weaker from prolonged malnutrition that threatens their ability to perform the physical labour required for successful crop establishment. Weather patterns during the spring gap create additional uncertainties that compound the challenges of surviving until new growth becomes available. Late frosts can destroy early wild plants just as they become ready for harvest, while extended cold periods delay plant development and prolong the dangerous waiting period. Conversely, early warm spells can accelerate plant growth but also increase human energy needs and create false expectations about food availability that lead to dangerous miscalculations about resource management. The timing of different wild foods creates a complex calendar that determines survival prospects for families who understand seasonal patterns versus those who lack detailed knowledge about natural food cycles. Tree buds, early greens, and various root vegetables become available at different times, requiring careful coordination of gathering activities to maximize nutrition while minimizing energy expenditure by already weakened family members. Missing optimal harvest windows for any particular food source could eliminate crucial nutritional opportunities during a period when every calorie matters. Community cooperation becomes both more essential and more difficult as families share information about food sources while competing for limited resources that everyone desperately needs. The discovery of a productive patch of early greens or a grove of trees with edible buds creates both opportunities for mutual assistance and potential conflicts over access rights that might normally be resolved through unestablished social conventions. Spring desperation tests community bonds in ways that winter resignation did not. Children's involvement in spring foraging activities increases as family seekers need every possible contributor to gathering efforts. But their participation also creates additional risks when inexperienced young people might mistake dangerous plants for safe ones or venture into hazardous areas while searching for food. Parents must balance the need for additional labour against the responsibility to protect children from risks they might not recognise or understand in their enthusiasm to help family survival efforts. The physical demands of spring foraging challenge bodies that have been weakened by months of inadequate nutrition, creating situations where the energy required to gather food might exceed the nutritional value obtained from successful expeditions. You learn to calculate these energy economics carefully, focusing gathering efforts on food sources that provide maximum nutritional return for minimum physical investment, while avoiding activities that could exhaust precious energy reserves without producing meaningful sustenance. Traditional spring festivals and religious observances take on intensified significance as communities seek spiritual comfort and collective meaning during the most psychologically challenging period of the famine year. Easter celebrations become particularly poignant as themes of death and resurrection resonate with families who feel suspended between winter's ending and spring's unfulfilled promise. These observances provide emotional support and community connection even when traditional feast foods remain unavailable for actual celebration. Medical knowledge about spring ailments becomes crucial as families experience health problems specific to the transition between winter scarcity and eventual spring abundance. Digestive systems weakened by months of inadequate and unusual foods react poorly to sudden changes in diet when fresh plants become available. The temptation to overconsume early spring greens can cause serious digestive problems for people whose bodies have adapted to starvation conditions and cannot immediately process normal quantities of fresh vegetation. You join thousands walking between towns, seeking charity and work as traditional village life temporarily collapses under the weight of universal scarcity that forces entire populations to abandon their homes and take to the dangerous roads that connect medieval settlements across a landscape marked by desperation and opportunity in equal measure. The begging roads open like arteries of human misery, carrying streams of displaced families whose attachment to particular places has been severed by hunger's imperious demands that override all other considerations, including safety, dignity, and the social bonds that normally anchor people to specific communities. The decision to leave your village represents a fundamental break with everything that has defined your family's existence for generations, abandoning not just physical property, but the entire network of relationships, obligations, and local knowledge that has sustained your ancestors through previous crises. Medieval people rarely travel beyond walking distance from their birthplaces during normal times, making the choice to become itinerant beggars a psychological trauma that compounds the physical hardships of starvation and homelessness. Your family joins the pathetic procession of displaced peasants trudging along muddy roads that have become rivers of human suffering, each group carrying the few possessions they could manage while maintaining enough mobility to cover the distances between settlements that might offer temporary relief. Children who should be learning agricultural skills from their parents instead receive education in survival techniques that previous generations never needed. How to identify sympathetic households, how to present appeals for charity most effectively, how to avoid the dangers that threaten vulnerable travellers on roads designed for commerce rather than refugee movements. The medieval road system creates bottlenecks and convergence points where streams of displaced families merge into larger groups that overwhelm the charitable capacity of the communities that might help individual families but cannot accommodate hundreds of desperate people arriving simultaneously. You witness the cruel mathematics of charity as towns that initially welcomed starving travellers quickly exhaust their ability to provide assistance and begin turning away families whose needs are identical to those earlier arrivals who received help simply through better timing. Begging requires skills that contradict everything your upbringing taught about self-reliance, dignity, and proper social relationships, forcing you to develop techniques for appealing to strangers' compassion while maintaining enough personal pride to function effectively as family leader and protector. You learn to present your family's situation in ways that generate sympathy without appearing threatening, to time your appeals for maximum effectiveness, and to recognize which potential benefactors might provide genuine assistance versus those who will waste your time and energy with false promises or hostile rejection. Competition among displaced families creates tensions that challenge moral principles about helping fellow sufferers, as charitable resources prove insufficient to assist everyone seeking aid, and families must choose between cooperation and competition in their approaches to survival. Groups that coordinate their begging activities might achieve better results than families working independently, but they also risk overwhelming potential benefactors and triggering hostile responses from communities that feel invaded by organised groups of displaced people. The geography of charity follows patterns that reflect medieval economic and religious structures, with monasteries, wealthy households, and market towns offering different types of assistance under varying conditions that require strategic thinking about travel routes and timing. Monastic communities traditionally provide food and shelter to travellers regardless of their economic status, but their resources become strained when normal numbers of occasional visitors are replaced by continuous streams of desperate families seeking sustained assistance rather than temporary hospitality. Historians still argue whether medieval charity systems could effectively respond to large-scale population displacement, or whether they were designed primarily for individual cases of temporary need. But your experience suggests that formal charitable institutions quickly become overwhelmed by the scale of demand during widespread famines. The gap between charitable capacity and actual need forces displaced families to develop informal survival strategies that supplement official assistance with begging, temporary labour, and various forms of mutual aid among fellow refugees. Seasonal timing affects begging success as agricultural communities experience their own cycles of abundance and scarcity that determine their ability to assist displaced families seeking help. Spring represents the worst possible time for charitable appeals, as settled communities face their own hunger gaps and lack surplus resources for sharing with outsiders. Harvest time offers better prospects for charity, but it also coincides with peak labourers' demands that might provide temporary employment opportunities for displaced families willing and able to work. The social hierarchy of begging reflects medieval class distinctions even among people reduced to similar circumstances by famine, as former craftsmen, merchants, and peasants maintain different approaches to charitable appeals based on their previous social positions and cultural backgrounds. Families with urban backgrounds might possess skills useful in market towns, but lack knowledge needed for agricultural labour, while rural families understand farming but may struggle to present themselves effectively in urban charitable contexts. Religious aspects of begging become crucial as appeals to Christian charity often prove more effective than simple requests for material assistance, requiring displaced families to frame their needs in terms of religious obligation and spiritual reward for benefactors. You learn to emphasize your family's piety, their innocent suffering, and the religious merit that charitable donors will earn through assistance, adapting your appeals to the spiritual concerns of potential benefactors even when your own faith has been tested by circumstances that seem to contradict divine justice and providence. Women's roles in begging activities reflect both their traditional association with charitable appeals and their particular vulnerabilities as displaced persons travelling on dangerous roads without adequate protection. Mothers with children often generate more sympathy than adult men, making family begging strategies that feature women and children while keeping men in background supporting roles. However, this approach also exposes the most vulnerable family members to greater risks from predatory individuals who might exploit their desperate circumstances. Economic opportunities for displaced families extend beyond simple charity to include temporary labour arrangements that provide both immediate resources and potential pathways to more permanent resettlement in communities that need additional workers. Harvest labour, construction projects, and various service positions might offer survival alternatives to pure begging, though competition for these opportunities intensifies when large numbers of displaced people seek the same employment possibilities. Violence against displaced families represents a constant threat as travelling groups become targets for robbery, assault, and exploitation by criminals who recognise that refugees lack community protection and legal recourse available to settle populations. Your family develops security strategies that balance mobility needs against safety concerns, travelling in groups when possible while avoiding concentrations large enough to provoke hostile responses from communities that view displaced populations as threatening rather than deserving of assistance. The psychology of displacement affects family relationships as traditional roles and responsibilities become irrelevant when survival depends on skills and circumstances that contradict normal social expectations. Parents who cannot provide security and sustenance for their children experience profound guilt and frustration, while children lose the sense of stability and predictability that normally characterizes childhood development. These psychological adjustments to homelessness create lasting effects that persist even when families eventually achieve resettlement and economic recovery. Communication networks among displaced populations create informal information systems that share knowledge about charitable opportunities, employment possibilities, and safety concerns affecting people travelling the begging roads. Families exchange information about which communities provide assistance versus those that respond with hostility, creating intelligence networks that help subsequent travellers make better decisions about routes and approaches to charitable appeals. Legal status issues complicate the situation of displaced families who move between jurisdictions with different laws, customs, and attitudes towards strangers seeking assistance. Medieval legal systems often restrict the movement of peasants bound to particular manners, making displacement potentially illegal, even when driven by survival necessity. Families must navigate these legal complexities while seeking assistance from authorities who might view them as lawbreakers, rather than legitimate refugees deserving protection and support. The duration of displacement varies dramatically based on individual circumstances, regional recovery patterns, and families' success in adapting to itinerant lifestyles that some people manage more effectively than others. Some families achieve resettlement within weeks or months, finding communities willing to accept additional residents and provide opportunities for establishing new permanent homes. Others remain on the roads for extended periods, developing semi-permanent nomadic lifestyles that persist long after the original famine conditions have resolved in their home regions. You make critical choices about rebuilding as the crisis slowly passes, determining your family's future survival chances through decisions that will echo through generations while the immediate threat of starvation gradually recedes, but leaves behind a transformed landscape of relationships, resources, and possibilities that bear little resemblance to the world that existed before. Hunger changed everything. The seeds of recovery must be planted not just in fields depleted by failed harvests, but in social structures weakened by desperate choices and community bonds strained by the brutal arithmetic of survival that forced neighbours to compete rather than cooperate. The first reliable signs that the famine is ending arrive not with dramatic abundance, but through subtle shifts in availability and pricing that indicate improving conditions without immediately restoring prosperity or security. Grain merchants begin appearing in local markets with small quantities of flour and seed. Their price is still exorbitant, but no longer completely impossible for families who have managed to preserve some trading resources through the worst periods. These early indicators of recovery create both hope and anxiety, as you realize that critical decisions made now will determine whether your family emerges from the crisis positioned for future prosperity, or trapped in cycles of poverty that could affect your children's entire lives. Seed allocation becomes the most crucial decision facing families as spring planting season approaches, with resources still desperately limited, but sufficient to support either adequate nutrition through the remaining recovery period or investment in crops that might restore economic stability by autumn harvest. You stare at the small quantities of grain you've managed to acquire through trade, begging and careful conservation, knowing that every kernel consumed today reduces next year's potential harvest, while every kernel saved for planting represents a meal denied to family members still weakened by months of malnutrition. The mathematics of agricultural recovery require understanding complex relationships between current investment, future production, and family survival needs that extend well beyond simple planting calculations. Seeds represent only one component of successful crop production, which also requires adequate labour, proper tools, sufficient fertilizer, and favourable weather conditions that remain uncertain after a year of agricultural disaster. Your family's physical condition affects their ability to perform the demanding labour required for successful farming, while damaged tools and depleted soil create additional challenges that must be addressed with resources you no longer possess. Community cooperation patterns emerge as families coordinate their recovery efforts through informal agreements that share risks, resources, and labour in ways that maximise everyone's chances of successful crop establishment and harvest. These collaborative arrangements often differ significantly from traditional social relationships, as the crisis has revealed new information about family capabilities, reliability, and priorities that affects future alliance patterns. You discover that some neighbours who seemed prosperous and reliable during normal times proved selfish or incompetent during the emergency, while other families demonstrated unexpected generosity and practical wisdom that makes them valuable partners for recovery efforts. Livestock decisions create additional complexity as families choose between immediate consumption of surviving animals versus preservation for breeding stock that could restore productive capacity over multiple years. Your family's remaining chicken provides a small but steady source of protein through daily eggs, but she also represents potential for rebuilding a flock that could eventually supply substantial nutrition and trading resources. The cow that barely survived winter could provide immediate meat for several weeks of adequate nutrition, or she could become the foundation for restoring dairy production and eventually breeding additional cattle. Historians still argue whether medieval agricultural recovery followed predictable patterns or remained vulnerable to random factors that could restart famine cycles. But evidence suggests that families who made wise decisions during early recovery phases achieved much better long-term outcomes than those who prioritized immediate comfort over future security. Your choices about resource allocation during this critical transition period will influence your family's economic position, social relationships, and survival capabilities for years or even decades into the future. Housing and infrastructure repairs compete with agricultural investments for attention and resources, as buildings damaged by neglect during the crisis require maintenance that prevents further deterioration, while fields demand preparation and planting that cannot be delayed without compromising the entire growing season. Your cottage's roof leaks from winter storms that went unrepaired when survival took priority over property maintenance, but fixing the damage requires materials and labour that might be better invested in activities that could produce food by autumn harvest. Technology and tool replacement becomes essential as implements damaged, lost or traded during the emergency must be restored for successful agricultural production. Though acquiring these necessities requires resources that remain extremely limited even as conditions improve. The ploughshares that were traded for food during winter's desperate months must somehow be replaced before spring planting, while hand tools essential for cultivation, harvesting, and food processing need repair or replacement that competes with other recovery priorities. Social relationship reconstruction requires navigating complex feelings about how community members behave during the crisis, as memories of generosity and selfishness affect trust levels and cooperation patterns that will influence future mutual aid arrangements. Families remember who shared resources when sharing meant personal sacrifice, who hoarded supplies while neighbours starved, and who proved reliable versus unreliable when survival depended on community cooperation. These memories shape alliance patterns and social hierarchies that may persist long after economic conditions return to normal. Regional economic integration affects local recovery prospects as trade relationships with neighbouring areas gradually resume, though the broader economic disruption caused by a widespread famine means that normal commercial patterns may take years to re-establish. Merchants who traditionally supplied imported goods, seasonal labourers who provided harvest assistance, and craft specialists who offered services to agricultural communities may have relocated, died, or changed their economic activities in ways that affect your region's capacity for full recovery. Child development considerations become important as families assess how famine experiences have affected young family members' physical growth, educational progress, and psychological health in ways that require specific attention during recovery planning. Children who missed crucial periods of physical development may need specialized nutrition and care that competes with other family priorities, while educational gaps created by survival-focused activities during the crisis may require additional time and resources to address adequately. Women's roles in recovery planning reflect both their detailed knowledge of household resource management and their particular insights into family needs that may not be obvious to male family leaders focused primarily on agricultural production issues. Mothers often possess better understanding of children's health requirements, family relationship dynamics, and domestic production capabilities that influence recovery strategies. Though social conventions may limit their direct participation in decision-making processes that affect entire family futures, debt and obligation management creates ongoing challenges as families attempt to balance repayment of resources borrowed during the emergency against continued investment in recovery activities that remain essential for long-term stability. Neighbours who provided assistance during desperate times expect eventual repayment or reciprocal aid, while formal borrowing arrangements with merchants or wealthy families carry specific terms that must be honoured, despite continuing resource constraints that make full repayment difficult or impossible. Risk assessment strategies become crucial as families evaluate different recovery approaches based on their potential for success versus the consequences of failure that could restart the cycle of desperation and displacement. Conservative strategies that prioritize stability and gradual improvement might offer better survival prospects but slower return to prosperity, while aggressive investment approaches could achieve rapid recovery or complete failure depending on factors beyond family control. Future preparation planning involves developing strategies for surviving potential future famines based on lessons learned during the current crisis, including resource storage techniques, community relationship management, and economic diversification that could reduce vulnerability to agricultural failures. Your family's experience provides valuable knowledge about survival strategies, but it also reveals the limitations of individual preparation when facing regional disasters that affect entire economic and social systems simultaneously. You emerge changed, carrying forward the hard-won knowledge that will help future generations face their own trials, as the lessons written in hunger become part of your family's inheritance that transcends material wealth to include wisdom about survival, community, resilience, and the fundamental truths about human nature that only extreme adversity can reveal. The person who struggled through this famine year bears little resemblance to the one who first discovered empty grain stores on that cold autumn morning. Transformed by experiences that stripped away comfortable assumptions about security, prosperity, and the predictable rhythms of agricultural life. The knowledge you've gained extends far beyond practical skills like foraging techniques, food preservation methods, and crisis resource management to encompass deeper understanding about what truly matters when everything familiar disappears and survival becomes the only priority that counts. You now know which neighbours can be trusted absolutely, which community relationships prove genuine versus superficial, and which personal strengths emerge when circumstances demand capabilities you never suspected you possessed. This wisdom cannot be learned from books or stories. It requires living through the reality of choosing between feeding your children today or saving seed for next year's planting. Your children have received an education no school could provide. Learning lessons about perseverance, creativity, cooperation, and the value of every scrap of food that will influence their attitudes and behaviours throughout their entire lives. They understand viscerally what older generations meant when they spoke about hard times, having experienced firsthand the difference between want and genuine need, between discomfort and actual suffering. These children will never waste food carelessly, never take abundance for granted, and never forget the importance of community support during crisis periods. Medieval society will absorb the lessons of this famine in ways that affect everything from agricultural practices to social relationships, creating changes that ripple through generations as survivors share their experiences and adapt their behaviours based on what they learned about vulnerability, preparation, and mutual aid. The communities that endured together develop stronger bonds and more effective cooperation patterns, while regions that experience social breakdown during the crisis work to rebuild trust and establish new frameworks for managing future emergencies. The stories you will tell about this year become part of your family's oral tradition, joining the accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of rural families who survived similar crises through knowledge, determination, and community support. Your grandchildren will learn about the winter when tree bark became bread, when neighbours shared their last loaves, when ordinary people discovered extraordinary strength they never knew they possessed. These stories serve not just as historical records, but as practical guides for recognizing warning signs, implementing survival strategies, and maintaining hope during seemingly impossible circumstances. Historians still argue whether medieval famines represented temporary disruptions in otherwise stable agricultural systems, or whether they revealed fundamental vulnerabilities that required systematic changes to prevent future crises. But your lived experience suggests that both perspectives contain truth. The immediate crisis has passed, but the underlying conditions that created vulnerability, dependence on single crop varieties, limited food storage capabilities, inadequate transportation networks for moving surplus from abundant areas to scarce regions, remain largely unchanged and could create similar disasters whenever weather patterns or other factors disrupt normal agricultural production. Your relationship with food has been permanently altered by months of scarcity that taught you to value every grain, every vegetable, every source of nutrition with an intensity that prosperous people cannot comprehend. Meals that would have seemed ordinary before the famine now feel like celebrations, while the ability to offer food to guests or share surplus with neighbours represents luxury beyond measure. You understand now why older family members always insisted on finishing every scrap on plates, why traditional sayings emphasise the sacred nature of bread, why rural communities developed elaborate customs around harvest celebrations and Thanksgiving observances. The physical marks of malnutrition may fade as adequate nutrition returns, but the psychological and social changes created by surviving extreme adversity will persist throughout your lifetime and influence how you approach future challenges, resource management, and family priorities. You possess knowledge about your own capabilities under stress, about your family's resilience and adaptability, about which survival strategies work effectively and which prove inadequate when tested by genuine crisis conditions. Community relationships have been reconfigured by shared experiences that revealed true character and created new bonds between families who supported each other through the worst periods while weakening connections with those who proved selfish or unreliable when cooperation became essential for survival. The village that emerges from this crisis may look physically similar to the one that entered it, but the social networks, trust patterns, and mutual aid systems reflect lessons learned about who can be counted on when everything falls apart. Economic understanding has been transformed by direct experience with markets that operate according to desperate rather than normal supply and demand patterns, where traditional value relationships collapse and survival necessities command prices that would seem impossible during abundant times. You now understand how quickly comfortable economic assumptions can become irrelevant, how normal commercial relationships depend on underlying stability that cannot be taken for granted, and how alternative economic systems based on barter, mutual aid, and gift exchange emerge when monetary systems prove inadequate for addressing survival needs. Agricultural knowledge has expanded to include techniques and resources that previous generations knew, but that modern prosperity had made unnecessary, creating capabilities that could prove crucial during future challenges, even if they seem primitive or inefficient during normal times. The ability to process acorns into flour, to recognize edible wild plants, to preserve foods through traditional methods, and to maximize nutrition from minimal resources represents insurance against future food security challenges that may not manifest for years or decades, but that could prove essential when they do occur. Spiritual understanding has been tested and refined through experiences that challenged comfortable beliefs about divine providence, justice, and the relationship between faith and material prosperity, while ultimately strengthening appreciation for aspects of existence that transcend material concerns. The prayers offered during the darkest moments carried urgency and sincerity that routine religious observance rarely achieves, while the gratitude felt for survival and recovery possesses depth that only those who have faced genuine existential threat can fully experience. The seasonal cycles that govern agricultural life now carry additional meaning as you understand viscerally how completely human welfare depends on natural processes beyond individual control, creating humility about human capabilities while also inspiring great appreciation for the miraculous complexity of systems that usually function so reliably that their importance becomes invisible. Spring's arrival feels like resurrection after a winter that tested whether life itself could continue, while autumn's harvest represents not just economic success, but confirmation that another year of survival has been secured. Personal identity has been reshaped by discovering inner resources and capabilities that remained hidden during comfortable times, learning that you could make impossible decisions, endure unimaginable hardships, and maintain family cohesion and hope when external circumstances seemed designed to destroy everything you valued. This knowledge about your own resilience and adaptability becomes part of your fundamental self-understanding, influencing how you approach future challenges with confidence earned through surviving the ultimate test of character and determination. As you settle into sleep on this first tour, when hunger no longer gnaws at your consciousness, when tomorrow's meals seem reasonably secure, when your family rests safely together, in beds that feel luxurious after months of cold and scarcity, you understand that you've been fundamentally changed by experiences that most people never face, and that you hope your children and grandchildren will never need to repeat. You also know that the strength, wisdom, and connection forged during this terrible year have prepared your family for whatever future challenges may arise, creating a legacy of resilience that will endure long after the memories of empty grain stores and desperate choices have softened into stories told around warm hearths during abundant harvests. Stories that remind future generations about the strength that ordinary people possess when circumstances demand extraordinary courage, creativity, and determination. The lessons written in hunger become part of who you are, carved into your character like scars that tell stories of survival, transformation, and the unbreakable human spirit that endures through the darkest times and emerges stronger, wiser, and more grateful for the simple miracles of daily bread, family love, and community bonds that make life not just possible but meaningful. Sweet dreams await those who have earned them through trials that test everything and ultimately reveal the indestructible core of human resilience that connects you to all who have faced such challenges before and all who may face them again. The famine year ends not with celebration, but with quiet recognition that survival itself represents victory beyond measure. Your family gathers around a table that holds actual food, watching firelight dance across faces that carry the wisdom of those who have looked directly into life's fundamental uncertainties and found strength they never knew existed within them.